Every night, Max, the family dog, weeps by the fireplace, his cries echoing through the house. When young Ethan uncovers the heartbreaking reason behind his sorrow, he's left in tears, realizing the dog's pain runs deeper than he could have ever imagined. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Max had always been a quiet dog. He was gentle and kind, a golden retriever with fur as soft as cotton. For years, he had lived with the Anderson family, a family that loved him dearly. He spent his days chasing tennis balls in the yard, playing with the children, and curling up on his favorite spot by the fireplace at night. But every night, when the clock struck midnight, something strange happened. Ethan, the youngest member of the Anderson family, first noticed it when he was around 10 years old. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe Max had gotten old and needed a little more rest than usual. But after a few nights, he became sure that something wasn't quite right. It started one evening when the house had gone silent. Everyone was asleep, the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway the only sound. Ethan had been tossing and turning in his bed, unable to sleep. He had a lot on his mind: school, friends, and the feeling that something was missing. It was strange, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Suddenly, he heard a soft whimpering noise coming from downstairs. Ethan froze, unsure of what he was hearing. It wasn't the usual sound of Max dreaming or barking in his sleep. No, this was different. It was a low, mournful cry, almost like the sound of someone in pain. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He sat up in bed and listened carefully, straining to hear the sound again. Sure enough, it came once more, soft but clear, followed by the faint rustle of paws on the wooden floor. Max. It had to be Max. Ethan felt a pang of worry in his chest. The dog had always been there for him. Whether it was keeping him company when he was sad or playing catch in the yard, Max had always been a faithful friend. But this sound, this wasn't like anything he had ever heard before. Without thinking twice, Ethan slipped out of bed and quietly padded down the hallway. He was careful not to make a sound, knowing that if anyone woke up, they would stop him from going downstairs. He knew his parents wouldn't be happy if they found out he was awake at this hour. As he reached the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace illuminated the room. There, by the hearth, sat Max. His eyes were wide open, staring at the crackling flames. His body trembled slightly, and his face, usually so joyful and full of life, was full of sorrow. Max's head was lowered, his tail tucked under his body, as if he was hiding from something. His whimpers grew louder, more desperate, as he stared into the fire. Ethan's heart ached for his dog. He had never seen Max like this before. Ethan stepped closer, unsure of what to do. He had no idea why Max was acting this way. Dogs usually slept soundly at night, not sat awake crying by the fireplace. He kneeled down beside him, gently placing a hand on Max's fur. "It's okay, Max," Ethan whispered softly, hoping to calm the dog down. "What's wrong?" Max turned his head slowly, and for the first time that night, he looked directly at Ethan. His eyes were full of sadness, eyes that seemed to hold years of pain, memories, and longing. Ethan's stomach dropped as he saw the tears glistening in the dog's eyes. Max whined again, his voice breaking through the silence. It was a sound that sent shivers down Ethan's spine, something that was too deep to be ignored. Ethan couldn't understand what was wrong, but he knew one thing: Max wasn't just sad. He was hurting. Ethan reached out to stroke the dog's head, hoping that would make him feel better, but Max flinched slightly, pulling away from his touch. Ethan's heart sank. It was as if Max didn't even want comfort. He just wanted to be left alone with whatever pain he was carrying. Ethan glanced at the fireplace, the flames casting long shadows on the walls. The warmth from the fire felt comforting, but it didn't seem to reach Max. Ethan looked around the room, trying to make sense of the situation. Everything appeared normal, there was nothing out of place. Except for Max. Max whimpered again, louder this time, and looked back at the fire. Ethan's eyes followed his gaze. There, sitting on the floor beside the hearth, was a small, old, leather collar. It was worn and faded, the stitching coming undone in places. Ethan frowned. He didn't recognize the collar. It wasn't Max's. Max's collar was bright red with a shiny tag on it, but this one looked ancient, like it had been there for years. Ethan's curiosity got the better of him, and he reached for the collar. As soon as his fingers touched it, Max let out a sharp cry and pulled back, as if trying to stop him from touching it. Ethan froze. Why was the dog so upset about a collar? The collar wasn't even his. But there was something about it that made Ethan feel uneasy, like it was connected to something deeper, something hidden. He stared at the collar for a moment, wondering what its story was. Max turned his head to look at Ethan once more, his eyes wide and pleading. Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze. It was as though Max was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate without words. Ethan felt a strange knot in his stomach. He had to know what was going on with Max. He carefully set the collar down on the floor and gently sat next to Max, wrapping his arms around the dog's trembling body. Max didn't pull away this time. He simply rested his head on Ethan's lap, still staring at the fire. Ethan felt a sense of sadness wash over him. He had never seen Max like this before. He had always thought of Max as the happy, playful dog who loved to run around the yard and chase after sticks. But now, Max seemed like a different dog altogether, one who was lost, broken, and in pain. Ethan wasn't sure what to do. He didn't know how to fix Max's pain or what was causing it. But as he sat there, the dog's head resting on his lap, a thought crossed his mind. What if this wasn't just a phase? What if Max had been crying like this every night, and no one had ever noticed? Ethan knew he had to find out more. He couldn't just sit by and let Max suffer in silence. There was something important about that collar, something that was tied to the dog's sorrow. Ethan wasn't sure what it was, but he was determined to uncover the truth. He sat there for what felt like hours, Max resting quietly against him. Slowly, the dog's trembling began to subside, and the whimpering faded into silence. Ethan could feel the warmth of the fire as it crackled and popped. It was the most peaceful the room had felt in a long time, but there was still a lingering sense of unease. Finally, Ethan made a decision. He would ask his parents about the collar. He would figure out why Max was so sad. But for now, as the clock continued to tick in the distance, he remained with Max, holding him close. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: something had changed that night. Max's tears had opened a door, and Ethan was going to walk through it to discover the truth. Ethan's curiosity grew stronger with each passing night. He had always loved animals, and Max, the family's golden retriever, was no exception. But Max was different. Ever since Ethan could remember, the dog had always been calm and playful, wagging his tail happily when anyone came near. But that all changed at midnight. It started with soft whimpers that would slowly turn into full-fledged cries, echoing through the house. Ethan couldn't understand why Max cried every night, but he knew it wasn't just because he was hungry or needed to go outside. The dog wasn't acting like himself. The first time Ethan noticed, he was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day of school. The house was quiet. His parents had already gone to bed, and the only sounds were the wind outside and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan loved the peace at night, but tonight something felt off. The crying started at exactly midnight. Soft at first, but growing louder with every passing minute. Ethan sat up in bed, his heart racing. He felt the need to check on Max. It wasn't like the dog to act this way. With a sense of urgency, Ethan quietly slipped out of his bed and tiptoed toward the door. He didn't want to wake his parents, so he moved as silently as possible. He peeked out of his room and down the hallway. The light from the living room flickered under the door, casting long shadows on the floor. The cries were louder now. Ethan could hear Max's whimpering clearly from the living room. He moved quickly, his feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. When he reached the doorway to the living room, he stopped for a moment, his eyes wide with concern. Max was sitting by the fireplace, staring at the flames. The dog's body was tense, his head hanging low, and tears filled his eyes. Max's soft whimpers filled the room, his sadness so clear in his posture. Ethan had never seen Max like this before. It felt like the dog was grieving, as though something had happened that made him so sad. Ethan wondered if something had happened to the dog, if maybe Max had gotten hurt or if he was missing something. But no, the dog didn't seem hurt. There was no limp, no obvious sign of pain. The only thing that seemed wrong was the way Max looked at the fire, his eyes glazed over, as if lost in a memory. Ethan hesitated in the doorway. He wanted to go to Max and comfort him, but he didn't know how. He had never seen Max act like this, and he didn't know what the dog needed. Instead, he watched, his heart aching for his loyal pet. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Max's crying continued for what felt like hours. Ethan was starting to feel sleepy, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the dog alone. He quietly sat down on the stairs, watching from a distance. The soft glow of the fireplace lit up Max's fur, giving the dog an almost ghostly appearance as he sat there, crying silently. Ethan wanted to understand why Max was so sad. He knew he had to find out, but where could he start? He wasn't sure if asking his parents would help. They were always busy, and they hadn't seemed as concerned about Max's late-night behavior as he was. Maybe they didn't notice, or maybe they just didn't think it was important. But Ethan wasn't like that. He needed to know why his dog was so upset. The next day, Ethan decided he would ask his parents. As he ate breakfast, he carefully picked at his cereal, his thoughts focused on Max. He had to know more. After school, he would try again. That afternoon, after finishing his homework, Ethan went to his mom in the kitchen. He stood quietly for a moment, watching her chop vegetables for dinner. Finally, he spoke up. "Mom, why does Max cry every night by the fireplace?" he asked softly. His mom didn't look up right away. She continued slicing the carrots, but Ethan could tell she had heard him. She stopped for a moment and glanced at him, a strange expression on her face. "Oh, honey, I think Max is just getting old," she said with a tired smile. "Sometimes older dogs do things like that. He's probably just remembering the good old days." Ethan wasn't convinced. He had heard his mom talk about the good old days before, but it didn't sound like that was what was going on with Max. The dog wasn't just sitting there, remembering. He was crying. "But Mom," Ethan pressed, "he cries every night. It's not just being old. There's something wrong, I know it." His mom sighed and put the knife down. She walked over to him and knelt down to his level. "Ethan, honey, it's just how things are sometimes. Max is fine, really. He just needs some extra care now that he's older. I'm sure he'll be fine after a while. Let's not worry about it too much, okay?" Ethan didn't feel satisfied with her answer. It was clear she didn't really know what was causing Max's strange behavior. He still wasn't sure what to do, but he knew one thing: if he wanted answers, he would have to find them on his own. The next few nights passed the same way. Ethan couldn't help but notice how Max continued to cry, how the dog sat by the fire, staring at the flames with those sad, tear-filled eyes. Ethan's curiosity turned to worry. He began staying up later and later, watching Max from his bedroom door, waiting to see if the dog would stop crying. But the cries never stopped. One night, Ethan decided that enough was enough. He had to get closer. He had to understand why Max was so sad. After dinner, when his parents were busy, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and slipped quietly out of his room. He was going to do what his parents hadn't been able to. He was going to figure out why Max was crying. When Ethan reached the living room, Max was already there, just as he had been every night. But tonight, there was something different. The fire had burned down to nothing but a few glowing embers. Max sat near it, his tail wagging slowly, but his eyes remained sad, locked on the remains of the fire. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach as he approached. "Max," he whispered softly, stepping closer to the dog. Max didn't seem to hear him. His focus remained solely on the fireplace. Ethan sat down next to him, feeling the warmth from the dying fire on his face. He gently reached out and touched Max's head. The dog flinched slightly but didn't move away. Ethan gently rubbed his fur, feeling the softness beneath his hand. "Why are you so sad, Max?" Ethan whispered, his voice full of concern. Max lifted his head slowly, turning to look at Ethan. The dog's eyes were full of sorrow, and for the first time, Ethan understood. This wasn't just about old age or being tired. Max wasn't crying because he was sick. Max was crying because he had lost something or someone. Ethan felt a deep sense of sympathy for the dog, and in that moment, he knew he had to find out more. Max whined softly, and Ethan placed his hand on the dog's back. He knew that the dog needed help, but he wasn't sure what kind of help Max needed. There had to be more to this than just old age. Ethan couldn't let it go. He had to know what had happened to make Max cry every night. He sat by the dog, his mind racing. What could he do? What could make Max feel better? He wasn't sure yet, but he was determined to find out. Every night, after the clock struck midnight, Ethan would lie awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and listening. It was always the same, the soft sound of his dog Max crying. At first, he thought it was just the sound of Max dreaming, but as the nights passed, Ethan realized it wasn't a normal sound. It wasn't the happy barking of Max when he saw someone or the excited panting when it was time for a walk. No, this was different. This was a sound that made Ethan's heart ache. Max was an old golden retriever, with a fluffy tail that wagged slowly these days and eyes that seemed to hold memories of long ago. Every night, just as the moonlight spilled through Ethan's window, Max would slowly walk to the living room and curl up next to the fireplace. He would lie down with his head resting on his paws, and then the crying would begin. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. The soft whimpering mixed with the crackling sound of the fire was the only noise that filled the house. Ethan could never understand why Max cried. His parents told him that dogs sometimes get lonely or scared, especially when they get older. But Ethan didn't think that was it. Max had been with their family for years, and he was loved by everyone. The cries felt more like something deeper, something that Max had been holding on to for a long time. One evening, after another round of soft, sad whimpers from the living room, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He had to know why Max was so sad. The mystery had been bothering him for weeks, and his mind raced with questions. Was something wrong with Max? Had something happened that no one had told him about? Was he missing something? Quietly, Ethan slipped out of his bed and tiptoed down the hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He was careful not to wake his parents, who were fast asleep in their room. As he reached the living room, he saw Max curled up by the fireplace just like every other night. The fire was still going, its orange glow dancing on the walls, casting shadows across the room. Max's head was low, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames, and his soft cries filled the room. Ethan stood still, watching. He felt a lump form in his throat. The sound of Max's crying was almost like a whisper, a plea for help that Ethan couldn't ignore. Ethan knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and watch his dog suffer. Quietly, he crept closer to Max, crouching down so that he was level with the dog. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't look up. Ethan hesitated for a moment before he reached out to gently stroke Max's fur. The dog's fur felt soft, but there was a weight in his body, a heaviness that made Ethan's heart ache. "Max," Ethan whispered softly, his voice barely a breath. "Why are you so sad?" Max let out another soft whine, and Ethan's eyes wandered around the room. That's when something caught his attention. On the floor next to Max, hidden partly under the dog's large paw, was something small. It was a picture frame, the glass covered in dust, as if it had been there for a long time. Ethan reached down carefully and picked it up, brushing off the dust to see what was inside. It was a photograph of a little girl. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around Max, and they were sitting by the same fireplace where Max had been crying. Ethan stared at the photo, his eyes wide with confusion. Who was this girl? And why was the photo hidden here, by Max's side? The girl in the picture looked so familiar, but Ethan couldn't place her. Her hair was dark and wavy, and her smile was warm and bright. She was sitting so close to Max, as if they were best friends. Ethan's curiosity grew. Who was this girl, and why did Max keep her picture hidden? As he sat down on the floor beside Max, he stared at the photo for a long time, his mind racing. Finally, he decided he had to find out more. He gently placed the photo on the couch and stood up, glancing over at Max. The dog didn't look at him, still lost in his quiet weeping. Ethan had a feeling that this photo held the answers. He knew he had to ask his parents about it, but they were asleep, and he didn't want to disturb them. He would have to wait until morning. But one thing was certain, Max's tears were not just about missing something. They were about someone very important. The next morning, after breakfast, Ethan found his mom in the kitchen, making pancakes. He felt nervous, unsure of how to bring it up, but he knew he had to ask. "Mom," Ethan started, his voice shaky. "Who's the girl in the picture with Max?" His mother paused, a look of surprise flashing across her face. She turned slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice quiet. Ethan's heart beat faster. "In the living room." Max had it next to him, by the fireplace. His mom's face softened, and she took a deep breath. She sat down at the kitchen table, and Ethan joined her, his eyes wide with anticipation. "That's Lily," his mom said gently. "She was your sister." Ethan blinked, confused. "My sister?" His mom nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. "Before you were born, we had a daughter named Lily. She was about your age, and she and Max were inseparable. They grew up together, played together, and spent every moment together. Max loved her so much." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know that. He had never heard about Lily before. His parents never mentioned her. Why hadn't they told him? His mom continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But one day, Lily got sick. Really sick. The doctors tried everything, but she passed away when she was just 8 years old. It broke our hearts, Ethan. And it broke Max's too." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He had always thought that Max was just a dog, an old pet who had been with them for years. But now he realized Max had been part of their family even before Ethan was born. Max had loved Lily with all his heart, just like a true friend would. And when Lily was gone, Max had never forgotten her. "Max cries every night because he misses her," his mom said softly. "He misses her more than anything." Ethan felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He had never known about Lily, but now he understood why Max cried. The dog was mourning the loss of his best friend, the one person who had loved him like no one else. Ethan's heart hurt for Max, and he wished he could do something to help him. That afternoon, Ethan took the photo of Lily and Max and placed it in a new frame. He set it on the mantelpiece by the fireplace, right where Max always sat. The photo was a reminder of the love between Max and Lily, a love that had never faded, even after all these years. Later that night, Ethan sat beside Max by the fireplace, his hand gently resting on the dog's back. Max looked up at him, his eyes still filled with the sorrow of the past. But this time, instead of crying, Max let out a soft sigh and laid his head on Ethan's lap. The dog's body was still heavy with grief, but in that moment, Ethan knew that Max wasn't alone anymore. Ethan whispered, "I miss her too, Max. I promise I'll take care of you." As Max closed his eyes and fell asleep, Ethan looked at the photo of Lily and smiled. He may not have known her, but he could feel the love she had shared with Max. And from that night on, he would make sure Max never had to feel alone again. Ethan was starting to understand why Max cried every night. He had learned that Max's sadness went far beyond just being a lonely dog. The picture he found by the fireplace, the one with his sister Lily, was the key to unlocking the mystery. He couldn't believe what he had discovered. Max wasn't crying for any random reason, he was mourning the loss of someone he loved deeply. That night, as Ethan sat by the fireplace, he felt the weight of the situation heavy on his heart. The image of Max, curled up by the hearth, whimpering softly with his eyes fixed on the burning flames, replayed in his mind. What was it that made the dog so sad? It was clear now that Max was grieving Lily, the sister he had loved so much. But how could Ethan help Max heal? He wasn't sure. What could he possibly do to make the dog feel better? It seemed like Max would never stop mourning the loss of Lily. It was hard to imagine a time when Max wouldn't sit by the fire, staring at the flickering flames with such sadness in his eyes. As Ethan sat there, watching Max rest beside him, he tried to understand what it must have been like for the dog. He remembered how much Lily had loved him, how she would talk to him softly and let him snuggle up beside her when she studied. Max had been her best friend, and now she was gone. Ethan couldn't imagine what it would feel like to lose someone so close. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Max wasn't just crying for himself, he was crying because he missed his friend. Ethan's eyes were filled with tears as he reached down to gently pet Max. The dog looked up at him, his soft brown eyes filled with sadness but also with a sense of peace. It was as if Max was finally letting go of some of his grief, just by being with Ethan. It was clear that Max had loved Lily in a way that only a dog could, and that love was something that couldn't be replaced or forgotten. Max, Ethan whispered softly, I know you miss her. We all do. He felt a tightness in his chest as he spoke. He could feel the love Max had for Lily, and it made his heart ache. Max looked at him, and for the first time, Ethan saw something new in the dog's eyes. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was a kind of understanding, as if Max knew that Ethan was trying to comfort him. Ethan felt a sense of connection with Max that he hadn't felt before. It wasn't just because they both missed Lily. It was because they both understood what it meant to lose someone you loved. Even though they were different, they were both grieving in their own ways. Ethan realized that Max's tears weren't just because he was sad, they were also because he had so much love to give, and that love had nowhere to go now that Lily was gone. Sitting there, with the warm glow of the fire crackling softly beside them, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't sure what exactly he could do to help Max, but he knew he had to try. If Max couldn't bring back Lily, then maybe he could help Max feel a little less lonely. The next morning, Ethan went upstairs and began searching through the boxes in the attic. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew that something in the attic might hold the key to helping Max. As he rummaged through the dusty boxes, he found an old, wooden photo album. The cover was scratched and worn, but inside were pages filled with pictures of his family, moments from when Lily was still alive. Ethan flipped through the album, feeling a mix of sadness and nostalgia. There were pictures of Lily and Max together, playing in the yard, running through the snow, and sitting side by the fireplace. In one photo, Lily was hugging Max tightly, her face lit up with joy. She had always had a special connection with the dog, and it was clear that Max had felt the same way. As Ethan turned the pages, he stopped at a picture of Lily and Max sitting by the fireplace, just like they used to. In the photo, Max's head rested gently on Lily's lap as she smiled down at him. Ethan stared at the picture for a long time, his heart aching. He could feel the love between the two of them even now, even in the stillness of the photo. Ethan knew what he had to do next. He grabbed the photo album and carried it downstairs, determined to show Max that he hadn't forgotten Lily. He placed the album on the coffee table in front of the fireplace and sat down beside it. Max, who had been lying quietly by the fire, raised his head and looked at Ethan with his soulful eyes. I found something, Max, Ethan said softly, reaching out to gently pat the dog's head. Something that might help us both remember her. He opened the album to the picture of Lily and Max by the fire and showed it to the dog. Max's ears perked up, and he sniffed the air, as if he recognized the image. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the dog gaze at the picture. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. It was as if time had stopped, and for just a few seconds, Ethan and Max shared a quiet understanding. Ethan could feel that the dog recognized the photo, and that he remembered the moments they had spent together. It was a small, quiet moment, but it meant everything. Max slowly walked over to the photo and sniffed it again, his tail wagging gently. Ethan smiled through his tears. "I think she's still with us, Max," he whispered. "She's never really gone." From that moment on, things began to change. Max's nightly cries didn't stop completely, but they softened. He no longer sat by the fireplace alone, staring into the flames in sorrow. Instead, he would lay quietly by Ethan's side, his head resting on the boy's lap, as if he had found a new source of comfort. Ethan's heart swelled with love for the dog. He knew that Max would never stop missing Lily, but he also knew that Max had found a new way to cope with his grief. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the dog's sadness would return, but there was also a sense of peace. Max wasn't alone anymore. He had Ethan to comfort him, just as Lily had once done. As the days passed, Max's behavior slowly began to change. He still went to the fireplace every night, but now he would lay there, calm and peaceful, his eyes closed in quiet reflection. The cries stopped, and the whimpers faded away. Ethan was amazed at the transformation. It was clear that the love Max had for Lily would never go away, but he had found a way to share that love with Ethan, too. Ethan realized that Max wasn't just mourning the loss of Lily. He was also remembering the good times they had shared, the love that had once filled their home. Max wasn't crying out of sadness anymore, he was crying out of love, a love that had been too big to hold inside. Ethan knew that he couldn't bring Lily back, but he had helped Max find a way to carry her memory with him. And in doing so, he had also learned that love, even in the face of loss, could bring healing. The pain would never fully go away, but it would become a part of their story, a story of love and memories that would last forever. And in the quiet of the night, as Ethan lay in bed listening to Max's soft breathing, he smiled, knowing that the dog wasn't crying anymore. He was simply resting, with the memory of his best friend still living on in his heart. Every night, Ethan sat quietly in his room, listening to the familiar sound of Max's soft whimpers from downstairs. It wasn't just an ordinary sound. It was the sound of deep sadness, a sorrow that seemed to linger in the air. Max, the old golden retriever, had been a part of the family for as long as Ethan could remember. But something about him was different now. Every night, right at midnight, he would drag himself to the same spot by the fireplace, curl up on the rug, and cry. It wasn't the usual whining dogs did when they wanted attention. No, Max's cries were filled with a pain that Ethan could not understand. Ethan had tried to ask his parents about it, but they just brushed it off. They said Max was getting old, and sometimes old dogs got a little emotional. But Ethan didn't believe that. He could see it in Max's eyes, the way they seemed to look beyond the flames of the fireplace, staring at something no one else could see. And the way his body trembled with each soft whimper. It wasn't just age. There was something deeper, something Max couldn't express with words. One night, after many days of wondering, Ethan decided he couldn't stay in his room any longer. He had to know the truth. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his parents. The hallway was dark, but Ethan had memorized the way to the stairs. He tiptoed down the wooden steps, the old house creaking softly under his feet. The living room was just ahead. He could see the glow of the fire through the crack in the door. Max was already there. Ethan pushed the door open a little, just enough to peer inside without disturbing the dog. Max was lying on the rug, his head resting on his paws, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. His fur glowed softly in the firelight, but there was a sadness in his gaze. Ethan stood frozen at the door, not wanting to interrupt, but unable to look away. Max's whimpers grew louder, and his body quivered. It was as if he was reliving something from the past, something painful, something he couldn't forget. Ethan's heart went out to him. He had to know what was going on, what was causing Max so much sadness. He took a deep breath and stepped into the room, the soft rug beneath his feet muffling his steps. Max didn't notice him at first. The dog was too focused on the flames, his eyes distant. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking softly. "Max," he whispered. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of his name, but he didn't move. Ethan knelt beside him, carefully reaching out to pet the dog's golden fur. Max let out a soft sigh and nuzzled Ethan's hand, as if finding comfort in his touch. Ethan sat down beside him, still unsure of what to do. He wanted to ask Max what was wrong, but he knew the dog couldn't answer him with words. But then, something caught his eye. It was something small, something Max had been holding under his paw. It wasn't the dog's usual toy or blanket. It was a picture frame. Ethan's curiosity piqued. He gently lifted the frame, his fingers brushing against the edges, and gazed at the picture inside. His breath caught in his throat. The photo was old and slightly faded, but it was clear enough to see who was in it. It was a picture of Max, much younger, with his fur still golden and bright, and a little girl. The girl was smiling brightly, her arms wrapped around the dog in a tight hug. She was laughing, her hair flying around her face. But what really took Ethan by surprise was the face of the girl. It was his sister, Lily. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Lily had been gone for years, ever since that terrible winter. He remembered it like it was yesterday. Lily had been in a car accident, and just like that, she was gone. Ethan had been too young at the time to fully understand what had happened, but now, seeing this photo, he understood something he hadn't before. Max hadn't forgotten Lily. He never had. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he stared at the photo. He couldn't imagine how Max must have felt, losing the one person he loved more than anything. The one person who had always been there for him. Max had always been protective of Lily, following her around the house, lying next to her when she did her homework, and curling up with her every night by the fireplace. She had been his best friend. But when she was gone, Max had been left alone. The thought of Max sitting by the fireplace every night, waiting for Lily to come back, was almost too much to bear. Ethan could feel his chest tightening as he thought about how much pain the dog must have been in. Max hadn't just been mourning Lily, he had been holding on to the memory of her, hoping that somehow, she would return. Ethan reached out and gently stroked Max's fur, trying to comfort him. The dog looked up at him with sad eyes, his tail thumping softly against the rug. Ethan's heart broke for him. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? Max had lost something that could never be replaced. "I'm so sorry, Max," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know you were still waiting for her." Max let out a soft sigh, as if acknowledging Ethan's words, but he didn't cry anymore. The tears that had been falling so freely moments before seemed to have stopped, as if the act of sharing his grief with someone else had helped ease the pain, even if just a little. Ethan stayed by the fireplace with Max for a long time, petting him gently, letting the dog know he wasn't alone. As the fire slowly burned out, casting soft shadows on the walls, Ethan made a decision. He didn't know how he could help Max, but he knew that he couldn't just let the dog suffer in silence. He would do whatever it took to make Max feel loved again, to show him that even though Lily was gone, he still had a family who cared about him. The next day, Ethan went to the attic. He knew there were boxes of old things up there, things that belonged to Lily. He carefully searched through the dusty boxes until he found something that made his heart flutter. It was a small, faded scarf, one that Lily used to wear all the time. It was soft, with pastel flowers embroidered on it. Ethan smiled through his tears as he held it in his hands. He knew exactly what to do. That night, Ethan went to the living room with the scarf in his hands. Max was already there, as always, curled up by the fireplace. Ethan sat down next to him and gently placed the scarf on the rug, beside the dog. Max sniffed the scarf curiously, and his eyes softened. It was as if he recognized the scent, the warmth that had once belonged to Lily. Ethan watched Max carefully. The dog didn't cry this time. Instead, he lay down next to the scarf, his body relaxing for the first time in ages. Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. Max wasn't completely healed, but he wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Ethan. For the first time in a long while, Max slept soundly by the fire, and Ethan, knowing that the dog had found a small piece of comfort, drifted off to sleep as well, his heart full of love for the dog who had once loved his sisters so much. Ethan sat on the living room floor, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just discovered. The photo frame with Lily's picture in it still lay beside him, and Max, the dog, had finally stopped crying. The golden retriever's eyes were closed, and his breathing had slowed, as if a great burden had been lifted from his old, tired body. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. The house, which once felt so full of warmth and laughter, now felt quieter, emptier somehow. He glanced at Max, who was curled up near the fireplace, the place where so many memories had been made. There was something peaceful in the way the dog lay there now. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Max wasn't trembling with sadness. Ethan's mind raced, and his emotions swirled. He felt sadness, but also a strange sense of understanding. Max missed Lily, and that was okay. They all missed her. Ethan stood up slowly, still holding the photo frame. He walked over to the mantel where the family had always placed decorations. It wasn't much, just some candles and a few small trinkets. He thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the room for something that could make it feel right again. Then, his eyes landed on the small vase of fresh flowers his mom kept on the coffee table. He knew what he needed to do. Quietly, he went to the kitchen, grabbed a handful of the flowers, and brought them back to the living room. Max didn't move as Ethan placed the flowers gently by the fireplace. Then, he went to the drawer and pulled out a small, empty notepad. He opened it to the first page and picked up a pen. He wasn't sure exactly what to write, but he knew it had to come from the heart. The words needed to be simple, kind, and full of love. He wasn't just doing this for Max, he was doing it for Lily, too. Ethan stared at the blank page for a moment. He thought about the times he remembered with Lily, her laughter, her jokes, how she'd always let him play with her toys even when she was much older than him. He missed her so much. Max missed her, too, and maybe they could both remember her together, in a way that would help them both heal. With a deep breath, he wrote, "In memory of Lily. Always with us." He stared at the words for a moment. It didn't seem like much, but somehow it felt right. Lily was always with them, in their hearts, in their memories, and in the love they still had for her. Ethan folded the note carefully and placed it beside the flowers. He looked at Max, who was still lying on the rug by the fireplace, eyes closed, as if in a deep sleep. Ethan's heart swelled with love for both Max and Lily. They were connected by memories, by a love that time could not erase. Max stirred slightly, opening his eyes and looking at Ethan. The dog's gaze wasn't filled with sadness anymore. It was softer, more peaceful. Ethan smiled gently and sat down next to him. He didn't need to say anything. He just rested his hand on Max's head, letting the dog feel the comfort of his touch. Max let out a quiet sigh, as if he, too, had finally found some peace. The clock on the wall ticked softly. It was almost midnight again, the time when Max usually began his nightly routine of crying by the fireplace. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, Max didn't get up. He stayed right there, beside Ethan, his head resting on the boy's lap as he breathed in the familiar scent of the home they had shared for so long. Ethan felt a sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't sure if Max would ever stop missing Lily completely. Maybe he never would. But that was okay. Some wounds didn't heal completely, and some memories stayed with you forever. But they didn't have to hurt anymore. They could just be memories, happy ones, sad ones, all of them mixed together, making the love stronger, not weaker. As the night wore on, Ethan sat by the fireplace with Max. The fire crackled and popped, sending little sparks dancing into the air. The room was warm, cozy, and quiet. For the first time in a long time, there was no weeping, no crying. Just a peaceful silence. Ethan could almost hear Lily's laughter, as if she were still in the house with them, watching over Max, watching over him. Max's eyes fluttered shut again, and his breathing became slower, more rhythmic. Ethan, too, felt his eyes growing heavy. The comfort of the moment wrapped around him like a soft blanket. He leaned back against the couch, Max still resting at his feet, and let the warmth of the room and the memories of Lily fill his heart. It didn't matter that she was gone. What mattered was that she had been there once, and that love had never truly left. As the hours passed and the fire began to die down, Ethan drifted off to sleep, his hand still resting gently on Max's fur. In the quiet of the night, the world outside seemed far away. Ethan dreamed of Lily, of days spent running through fields and laughing together. And in his dream, Max was with them, tail wagging, his eyes bright with joy. When Ethan woke the next morning, the house was filled with the soft light of early morning. The fireplace was cold now, the embers long gone. But the flowers, the note, and the picture frame were still there, a small tribute to the love that had once been. Max was awake, too, his head still resting on the rug by the fireplace. His eyes met Ethan's, and for a brief moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. Max didn't need to cry anymore. Neither did Ethan. The boy stood up slowly, stretching his arms above his head. He smiled at Max, who wagged his tail just once, then lay back down. Ethan walked over to the window and looked out. The world outside was bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. It was a new day, a new beginning. They would carry the memories of Lily with them, always. But they didn't have to let the sadness take over. They could smile for her, remember the good times, and keep her in their hearts forever. Ethan's parents came downstairs, rubbing their eyes and stretching. When they saw the flowers and the note, they exchanged a look of surprise. Ethan smiled at them. "Max is okay," he said quietly. "He's not sad anymore." His mother knelt beside Max, gently stroking his fur. "Thank you, Max," she whispered. "You've been such a good boy." Max lifted his head slightly, and though he couldn't speak, it was clear that he understood. He was content now. His heart had found a kind of peace. Ethan stood beside his parents, watching as Max closed his eyes once more, a peaceful look on his face. There were no more tears, no more weeping by the fireplace. It had been a long journey, but now, both Ethan and Max knew that they could let go of the sadness, knowing that Lily was always with them, in every memory, and every laugh, and in the love they shared. And so, the house was quiet again, but not in the same way it had been before. The silence was filled with love, with remembrance, and with the comforting thought that some bonds, even the ones between a boy and his dog, could never be broken. Ethan smiled as he sat down next to Max, resting his head against the dog's soft fur. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew that everything would be okay now. Ethan's heart was racing as he sat by the fireplace with Max, his hand gently stroking the dog's golden fur. The soft crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, and Ethan felt as if the world had become a quiet, peaceful place. He looked down at Max, who lay beside him, his big brown eyes filled with a mix of sadness and trust. Ethan had learned something important that night, something that made his heart feel heavy but also full of understanding. Max wasn't just a dog who cried because he was old or tired. He was grieving. Max had lost something, someone, and every night, he was trying to hold on to that memory, even though it hurt. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the picture frame he had found. The one with Max and Lily, his older sister. He remembered her face clearly, her bright smile, her sparkling eyes, the way she always had time to play with him and make him laugh. Lily had been the best sister. She had always taken care of him, made him feel safe, and when they were together, everything seemed perfect. But everything had changed that winter when Lily had died in that terrible car accident. Ethan was just a little kid at the time, too young to fully understand what had happened, but he knew enough to feel the deep emptiness that came after she was gone. Now, sitting by the fire with Max, Ethan realized something else. The dog hadn't just lost his best friend, he had also lost a part of himself. Max had been Lily's constant companion, and when she was no longer there, Max was left with nothing but memories. Ethan had always wondered why Max seemed so sad all the time. Now, it made sense. Max missed Lily, just as Ethan did, just as their parents did. They all missed her, and Max's nightly cries were a way of remembering the girl who had been so kind to him. Max didn't know how to stop missing her, and so he kept crying, hoping that somehow his sadness would reach her. Ethan's hand trembled as he continued to pet Max. He wished there was something he could do to make the dog feel better. He wished he could bring Lily back, so everything could go back to the way it had been. But that wasn't possible. Nothing could bring her back. Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. He didn't want to cry in front of Max. The dog had enough sadness already. But as Ethan sat there, he realized something important. He had Max now, and Max had him. They were both grieving, both feeling the same pain. But they didn't have to do it alone. Ethan remembered how his parents had tried to comfort Max before, but they didn't understand the depth of his sorrow. They didn't know about the picture, or about how Max had spent so many nights curled up by the fireplace, crying for Lily. But Ethan did. And that made him feel connected to Max in a way he had never felt before. It was strange how a dog could make you feel understood, even though they couldn't talk. Ethan didn't have to say anything for Max to know how he felt. The dog seemed to understand him better than anyone else. When Ethan had been sad after Lily's death, Max would curl up beside him and rest his head on his lap, as if trying to comfort him without words. And now, sitting there with the dog, Ethan knew that he was doing the same thing for Max. They were both hurting, but they were together, and that made the pain feel a little less sharp. Max stirred and looked up at Ethan, his big eyes searching his face. For a moment, Ethan felt as if the dog was trying to tell him something. He reached down and scratched behind Max's ears, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur. Max let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing as he leaned into Ethan's touch. Ethan smiled faintly. It was like they were both healing, just a little bit at a time. But even as Ethan sat there, he knew that the journey wasn't over. Max's grief wouldn't just go away overnight. It would take time, and it would take effort. Ethan couldn't fix everything, but he could help Max. And Max could help him too. It wasn't about erasing the pain or pretending that everything was okay. It was about acknowledging the hurt and finding ways to move forward together. Ethan had an idea. He stood up slowly, still holding the picture frame with Lily and Max in his hand. Max watched him closely, his eyes following every movement. Ethan walked over to the small table by the window, where his mother kept a vase of flowers. He picked up a fresh daisy, its white petals soft and delicate. The bright yellow center reminded him of Lily's sunny personality, how she had always loved flowers, especially daisies. Ethan turned back to Max, who was still lying on the rug by the fire. He placed the daisy gently beside the picture frame, looking at the two things that meant so much to him, his sister and the dog who had loved her. "I think Lily would want you to be happy again, Max," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know she'd want that for both of us." Max tilted his head as if he understood, his eyes softening as he looked at the picture of Lily. For a moment, there was complete silence in the room, just the soft crackling of the fire and the quiet hum of the house. Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had Max by his side, and Max had him. They didn't have to face the sadness alone anymore. Ethan sat back down beside the dog, his hand resting gently on Max's back. The warmth of the fire filled the room, and for the first time, the house felt like a place of comfort instead of sorrow. Max's breathing became steady, and his body relaxed as if he was finally able to let go of some of the grief that had weighed him down for so long. As the night wore on, Ethan and Max stayed by the fireplace, neither of them speaking, but both finding a sense of peace in the quiet company of each other. The fire slowly burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, golden light across the room. Max's tail gave a small, contented wag as he rested his head on Ethan's lap, and the boy smiled down at his furry friend. In that moment, Ethan understood something important. Grief wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, but it was something that could be shared. and as long as he had Max by his side, he didn't feel so alone in his pain. He was ready to face the future, to heal, and to remember Lily with love, just as Max had done all those years. Because sometimes, healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant finding a way to live with the love that would always remain. The night drifted on, and Ethan finally let his eyes close, feeling the warmth of the fire and the comfort of Max beside him. Together, they both drifted into a peaceful sleep, their hearts a little lighter than before. The world outside may have been dark and uncertain, but in that moment, Ethan knew that he and Max would face whatever came next, together. Ethan's heart raced as he stood in front of the fireplace, holding the photo of his sister, Lily. Max, the old golden retriever, lay at his feet, watching him with eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sorrow. The room was quiet except for the soft crackling of the fire. Ethan could feel a heaviness in the air, like something important was about to happen, something he didn't quite understand yet. He placed the photo gently on the mantel. The picture was old and slightly faded, but it still showed Lily smiling, her arms around Max's neck. Ethan remembered that day like it was yesterday. He had been so small, running around the backyard while Lily and Max played fetch. She had always been the one to make Max chase after the ball, laughing every time the dog leapt into the air to catch it. Ethan had watched them from the window, feeling a mix of happiness and longing. He had wanted to be part of their world, but at that age, he was too young to understand how close the two of them had become. Now, it was just him and Max. Lily was gone, taken away in a horrible accident that Ethan could barely remember. He only knew the story from what his parents had told him. He remembered the sadness in their eyes when they spoke about her, the way the house had felt empty without her bright laughter. It was as if everything had changed the day she was gone. Max had always been there, though. He was more than a dog to their family. He was a protector, a friend, and a companion. And when Lily died, it was like Max had lost a piece of himself. Ethan didn't know it at the time, but he now understood that Max had been mourning her all these years. Every midnight, the dog's soft whimpers were a reminder of how deeply he missed the girl who had loved him so much. Ethan had seen the pain in Max's eyes, but he hadn't understood it fully. He'd thought it was just a sad, old dog being nostalgic. But after discovering the photo, the journal, and hearing his parents' story, everything made sense. Max wasn't just sad because he was old, he was grieving the loss of his best friend. The more Ethan thought about it, the more his heart ached. He remembered how much Max had loved Lily, how he would curl up beside her on the couch and follow her everywhere she went. Max had always been there, just as loyal as any dog could be. But now, that loyalty was still keeping him bound to the past, to the memory of the girl he had lost. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he set the photo back down, next to the small candle that flickered softly. He looked at Max, who lay on the floor, his head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes were closed, but there was a sense of peace around him now, something that had been missing for so long. Ethan could feel that Max was no longer crying, no longer haunted by the memories of Lily. But Ethan knew that peace wouldn't last forever. Max had been carrying this sorrow for so many years, and though Ethan had just uncovered the reason for the dog's midnight cries, he knew that healing wasn't something that could happen in a single night. It would take time for Max to fully understand that Lily wasn't coming back. It would take time for Max to find peace with her memory. Ethan sat down beside the dog and gently stroked his fur. Max's tail wagged weakly, and the dog sighed, his body relaxing under Ethan's touch. Ethan felt a sense of comfort in that moment, as though he and Max were silently telling each other that everything would be okay. They had both lost someone they loved, but they still had each other. As Ethan sat there, lost in his thoughts, he remembered how much Lily had loved their family. She had always been the one who brought everyone together, who made everything feel like it was okay, even when things were hard. Ethan missed her terribly, but he also felt a sense of gratitude for all the happy memories they had shared. And in a way, he knew that Lily's spirit was still there in their house, watching over them. Max was the one who had kept those memories alive, even if the dog didn't fully understand why. Every night, Max had cried because he missed her, because he didn't know how to say goodbye. But Ethan knew now that it wasn't just sadness, it was love. Max's weeping wasn't just about the pain of losing Lily, it was a testament to how much he had loved her. And that love would never go away. Ethan felt a tear slip down his cheek as he thought about how much Max had given up in order to stay loyal to Lily. The dog had carried that burden alone for so long. Now, Ethan wanted to help him carry it. He wanted Max to know that it was okay to let go, that he didn't have to keep crying every night. Lily was gone, but her memory would live on in their hearts. Max didn't need to weep anymore because he wasn't alone. Ethan would be there for him, just like Lily had been. The wind howled outside, and the room grew colder as the fire burned lower. Ethan wrapped his arms around Max, pulling the dog close. Max's warm body pressed against his, and for a moment, Ethan could almost feel the presence of Lily with them, a silent guardian watching over them. The feeling was so strong that it made Ethan's heart swell with emotion. Max lifted his head, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was a look in his eyes, something that Ethan couldn't quite explain. It was as if Max knew, in that moment, that he was no longer alone in his grief. Ethan had shared the pain with him, and together, they could find a way to heal. Ethan whispered softly, "I'm here, Max. I'm here for you, just like Lily would have wanted." The dog's tail gave a weak wag, and Ethan smiled through his tears. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Max was the first to stir. His eyes fluttered open, and he stood up slowly, stretching his legs. Ethan watched the dog carefully, waiting to see if the sadness would return. But as Max padded over to him, there was a lightness in his steps, a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, they had both started to heal. He didn't know what the future would bring, or if Max would ever stop missing Lily completely. But he knew that they would face whatever came next together, as a family. Max nudged Ethan gently, and the boy laughed softly. "Come on, old boy," he said, "let's go get some breakfast." As they walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, Ethan felt a peace settle over him. The pain of the past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He and Max would carry on, finding joy in the little moments, and the quiet peace of the mornings. And maybe, just maybe, the next time Max looked at the fireplace, he wouldn't weep. Maybe he would remember Lily with a smile, knowing that her love was still with him, and every wag of his tail, and every moment they shared. The world outside was still, the early light soft and golden. But inside their home, Ethan and Max had found something even more valuable than the quiet morning. They had found healing, together. And for the first time in a long time, the dog's cry had stopped.